Chapter 6. Troubleshooting diffusion. Diffusion doesn't work, snapped John. What do you mean? I asked. Well, he said, I had to give this presentation at work in front of about 50 people. My mind kept telling me I was going to screw up and make a fool of myself, so I tried those diffusion techniques, but they did nothing. You mean you kept buying into the story that you'd screw up? No, it helped with that. I stopped taking it seriously. Then why do you say diffusion doesn't work? Because I still felt anxious. John, I said, I've been giving talks in public for over 20 years, and I still feel anxious every time I get up there. I've met hundreds of people who speak to audiences as part of their profession, and I've always asked them, do you get anxious when you give a talk? So far, almost every single person has said yes. The point is, if you're going to put yourself in any sort of challenging situation, if you're going to take any significant risk, then anxiety is a normal emotion. It will be there, and diffusing negative thoughts is not going to get rid of it. Many of us, when we first encounter diffusion, fall into the same trap as John. We start trying to use diffusion as a control strategy. Remember, a control strategy is any attempt to change, avoid, or get rid of unwanted thoughts and feelings. Control strategies are problematic when they are used excessively, or in situations where they can't work, or when using them reduces our quality of life in the long term. Diffusion is the very opposite of a control strategy. It's an acceptance strategy. In ACT, rather than attempting to change, avoid, or get rid of unpleasant thoughts and feelings, our aim is to accept them. Acceptance doesn't mean you have to like your uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. It just means you stop struggling with them. When you stop wasting your energy on trying to change, avoid, or get rid of them, you can put that energy into something more useful instead. This is best explained with an analogy. Imagine you live in a small country that shares a border with a hostile neighbor. There is long-standing tension between the two countries. The neighboring country has a different religion and a different political system, and your country sees it as a major threat. There are 3 possible scenarios for how your country can relate to its neighbor. The worst-case scenario is war. Your country attacks, and the other one retaliates, or vice versa. As both countries get pulled into a major war, the people of both nations suffer. Think of any major war and the huge costs involved in terms of life, money, and well-being. Another scenario, better than the first but still far from satisfactory, is a temporary truce. Both countries agree to a ceasefire, but there is no reconciliation. Resentment seethes beneath the surface, and there is the constant underlying threat that war will break out again. Think of India and Pakistan, with the constant threat of nuclear war and the intense hostility between Hindus and Muslims. The third possibility is genuine peace. You acknowledge your differences and allow them just to be. This doesn't get rid of the other country, nor does it mean that you necessarily like it or even want it there, nor does it mean that you approve of its politics or religion. But because you're no longer at war, you can now use your money and resources to build up the infrastructure of your own country, instead of squandering them on the battlefield. The first scenario, war, is like the struggle to get rid of unwanted thoughts and feelings. It's a battle that can never be won, and it consumes a huge amount of time and energy. The second scenario, a truce, is definitely better, but it's still a long way from true acceptance. It's more like a grudging tolerance. There's no sense of moving forward to a new future. Although there is no active warfare, the hostility remains, and you are resigned to the ongoing tension. A grudging tolerance of thoughts and feelings is better than an outright struggle, but it leaves you feeling stuck and somewhat helpless. It's a sense more of resignation than of acceptance, of entrapment rather than freedom, of being stuck rather than moving forward. The third scenario, peace, represents true acceptance. Notice that in this scenario, your country doesn't have to like the other country, approve of its being there, convert to its religion, or learn to speak its language. You simply make peace with them. You acknowledge your differences, you give up trying to change their politics or religion, and you focus your efforts on making your own country a better place to live in. It's the same when you truly accept your uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. You don't have to like them, want them, or approve of them. You simply make peace with them and let them be. This leaves you free to focus your energy on taking action that moves your life forward in a direction you value. The true meaning of acceptance. Acceptance does not mean putting up with or resigning yourself to anything. Acceptance is about embracing life, not merely tolerating it. Acceptance literally means taking what is offered. It doesn't mean giving up or admitting defeat. It doesn't mean just gritting your teeth and bearing it. It means fully opening yourself to your present reality, acknowledging how it is, right here and now, and letting go of the struggle with life as it is in this moment. But what if you want to improve your life, and not just accept it as it is? Well, that's the whole purpose of this book. But the most effective way to make changes in your life is to start by fully accepting it. Suppose you are walking across ice. In order to safely take the next step, you first need to find a firm foothold. If you try moving forward without doing that, then you're likely to fall flat on your face. Acceptance is like finding that firm foothold. It's a realistic appraisal of where your feet are and what condition the ground is in. It doesn't mean that you like being in that spot, or that you intend to stay there. Once you have a firm foothold, you can take the next step more effectively. The more fully you accept the reality of your situation, as it is, here and now, the more effectively you can take action to change it. The Dalai Lama exemplifies this beautifully. He fully accepts that China has invaded Tibet, and that he is forced to live in exile from his own country. He doesn't waste time and energy in wishful thinking, getting outraged, or dwelling morosely on what he's lost. He knows that won't help, nor does he admit defeat, or throw the whole issue into the too hard basket. Instead, he acknowledges that right now, this is the way it is, and at the same time, he does everything in his power to help. He actively campaigns all around the world to increase public and political awareness of Tibet's predicament, and to raise financial support for its people. In another example, let's consider the case of domestic violence. If your partner is physically violent, the first step is to accept the reality of the situation, that you are in danger and you need to take action to protect yourself. The next step is to take action. Get some professional help, take legal action, and/or leave the relationship. In order to take this action, you will need to accept the anxiety, guilt, and other painful thoughts and feelings that are likely to rise. So this is what ACT is all about: acceptance and action, side by side. The core philosophy of AST is neatly encapsulated in the Serenity Challenge. Develop the courage to solve those problems that can be solved, the serenity to accept those problems that can't be solved, and the wisdom to know the difference. If your life isn't working for you, the only sensible thing is to take action to change it. That action will be far more effective when you start from a place of acceptance. All the time and energy that you waste on struggling with thoughts and feelings could be far more usefully invested in taking action, the right action. A rich, full, and meaningful life comes about through accepting your thoughts and feelings instead of fighting them, and taking effective action, guided by your deepest values. So what are the costs of non-acceptance? What happens in the long run when you try to avoid or get rid of unpleasant thoughts and feelings? Do your control strategies work? Are they giving you the life you want? Acceptance is a powerful alternative to control. You've already discovered that many unpleasant thoughts are far less painful when diffused, and in later chapters you'll discover similar transformations with negative feelings. How to use diffusion. Now let's return to John's comment that diffusion doesn't work. John was trying to use diffusion to get rid of his anxiety. No wonder it didn't work. Diffusion is not some clever way to control your feelings. It's simply an acceptance technique. True, diffusing unhelpful thoughts will often reduce feelings of anxiety, but that's just a beneficial byproduct, a bonus. It's not the main thing. If you try to use diffusion to control anxiety, or any unpleasant feeling for that matter, sooner or later you'll end up frustrated. But what if you've diffused a thought and it's still there? Again, diffusion isn't about getting rid of thoughts. It's about seeing them for what they really are and making peace with them, allowing them to be there without fighting them. Sometimes they will go away with very little fuss. Other times they will hang around for quite a while, and sometimes they'll go away and then come back again. The point is, once you allow them to be there without a struggle, you can put your energy and attention into activities you value. But if you expect that diffusing your thoughts will make them go away, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. You're falling back into the agenda of control, the happiness trap. The aim is to accept your thoughts, not to get rid of them. And remember, you don't have to like a thought in order to accept it. You can accept it purely out of pragmatism. The thought is already there whether you like it or not, and struggling with it just takes up your time and energy without any long-term benefit. Acceptance frees up your energy for life-enhancing activities. It's okay to want to get rid of an unpleasant thought. In fact, it's expected, given that that's what you've been trying to do your whole life. But wanting to get rid of something is quite different from actively struggling with it. For example, suppose you have an old car that you no longer want, and suppose you won't have an opportunity to sell it for at least another month. You can want to get rid of the car and simultaneously accept that you still have the car. You don't have to try to smash the car up, make yourself miserable, or get drunk every night just because you still have that old car. So if you do find yourself struggling with a negative thought, just notice it. Pretend that you're a scientist observing your own mind. Notice the different ways in which you struggle. Do you challenge your thoughts, trying to disprove or invalidate them? Do you judge them as good or bad, true or false, positive or negative? Do you try to push them away or replace them with better ones? Do you enter into a debate with your mind? Observe your struggle with interest and notice what it accomplishes. Of course, some stories are more persistent than others. They come back again and again. Remember my I'm incompetent story? I've had that story for as long as I can remember. It visits me much less often now, but it still pops into my mind from time to time. The difference is, now I don't believe it. But if a helpful thought shows up like, I just stuffed up, how can I learn from this? Then I certainly do pay attention. It's important to let go of any expectation that your stories will go away or show up less frequently. As it happens, very often they will go away. But if you're diffusing them to make them go away, then by definition you're not truly accepting them. And you know where that leads. But, I hear you ask, aren't positive thoughts better than negative thoughts? Not necessarily. Remember, the most important question is this thought helpful? Suppose an alcoholic brain surgeon thinks to himself, hey, I'm the greatest brain surgeon in the world. I can do brilliant surgery even if I've been drinking. It's a positive thought, but surely not a helpful one. Most people convicted of drink driving have had positive thoughts of a similar nature. The same applies to neutral thoughts. In this book, I mostly talk about negative thoughts, simply because they're the ones we most often have problems with. But anything that applies to negative thoughts also applies to neutral and positive thoughts. The bottom line is not whether a thought is positive or negative, true or false, pleasant or unpleasant, optimistic or pessimistic, but whether it helps you create a fulfilling life. So should you believe any of your thoughts? Yes, but only if they're helpful, and hold those beliefs lightly. And even while you're holding them, know that they are nothing more than language. As time goes on, and you work through the rest of this book, you will learn to diffuse unhelpful thoughts quickly and easily. But it's important to remember, cognitive fusion is not the enemy. Making plans for the future, brainstorming solutions for your problems, mentally rehearsing your actions, getting lost in a book, engaging in a conversation, reading music, writing a letter, telling someone you love them. All these activities involve cognitive fusion. So cognitive fusion is not the enemy. It's an essential part of being human. Negative thoughts are not the enemy either. Because of the way our minds have evolved, many of our thoughts are negative to some extent. So if you consider them to be the enemy, you're always going to be battling with yourself. Thoughts are merely sounds, words, symbols, or bits of language. So why declare war on them? Our aim here is to increase our self-awareness, to recognize when we're fusing with our thoughts, and to catch ourselves when it happens. Once we have that awareness, we then have a much greater choice as to how we act. If thoughts are helpful, make use of them. If they are unhelpful, then diffuse them. Keep in mind that the diffusion techniques we've covered so far are like those inflatable armbands young children use in swimming pools. Once you can swim, you don't need them anymore. The idea is that later on, as you incorporate the other ideas within this book, you can diffuse your thoughts without giving them too much attention. You can be thoroughly engaged in your work, a conversation, or any other meaningful activity. And when an unhelpful thought pops into your head, you can instantly see it for what it is, and let it come and go without it distracting you. This will be much clearer after the next chapter, in which we explore an immensely powerful aspect of human consciousness, a resource within us that has been so overlooked by Western society that there isn't even a common word for it in the English language. But don't turn the page straight away. Why not wait a few days before reading on? And in the meantime, practice your diffusion skills. And if your mind says, "It's all too hard, I can't be bothered," simply thank it. Chapter 7. Look Who's Talking. Have you ever noticed some strange or disturbing thought pop into your head and wondered, where did that come from? Have you ever been chided for not paying attention and said, "Sorry, I was somewhere else"? Do you ever suddenly realize that your mind has wandered? If we look more closely at these expressions, we can see that they point to something rather curious. Where did that thought come from? And where did it go? And if you were somewhere else, then where were you? And how did you get back from there? ACT answers these questions by teaching you to recognize two different parts of yourself: the thinking self and the observing self. The thinking self is the part of you that thinks, plans, judges, compares, creates, imagines, visualizes, analyses, remembers, daydreams, and fantasizes. A more common name for it is the mind. Popular psychological approaches such as positive thinking, cognitive therapy, creative visualization, hypnosis, and neurolinguistic programming all focus on controlling the way your thinking self operates. This is all great in theory, and it appeals to our common sense. But as we have seen, the thinking self is just not that easy to control. Again, it's not that we have no control. After all, throughout this book, we look at many ways to think more effectively. It's just that we have much less control than the experts would have us believe. The observing self is fundamentally different from the thinking self. The observing self doesn't think. It is the part of you that is responsible for focus, attention, and awareness. While it can observe or pay attention to your thoughts, it can't produce them. Whereas the thinking self thinks about your experience, the observing self registers your experience directly. For example, if you are playing baseball, cricket, or tennis, and you are truly focused, then all your attention is riveted on that ball coming towards you. This is your observing self at work. You are not thinking about the ball, you are observing it. Now suppose thoughts start popping into your head like, "I hope my grip is correct. I'd better make this a good hit," or "Wow, that ball is moving fast." That is your thinking self at work. And of course, such thoughts can often be distracting. If your observing self pays too much attention to those thoughts, then it is no longer focused on the ball, and your performance will be impaired. How often have you been focused on a task, only to be distracted by a thought such as, "I hope I don't screw this up"? Or suppose you're watching a magnificent sunset. There are moments when all you are doing is looking at it. Your mind is quiet. There are no thoughts running through your head. You're simply registering the many colors of the spectacle before you. This is your observing self at work. Observing, not thinking. Then your thinking self kicks in. "Wow, look at all those colors. This reminds me of that sunset we saw on holiday last year. I wish I had my camera. It's so beautiful. This looks like something out of a movie." The more attention your observing self pays to the running commentary of the thinking self, the more you lose direct contact with that sunset. Although we all understand words such as awareness, focus, and attention, most of us in the Western world have little or no concept of the observing self. As a result, there is no common word for it in the English language. We only have the word mind, which is generally used to denote both the thinking self and the observing self, without distinguishing between the two. To reduce confusion, whenever I use the word mind in this book, I am referring only to the thinking self. When I use terms like attention, awareness, observing, noticing, and direct experience, I'm referring to various aspects of the observing self. As this book progresses, you will learn how to tune in and use this amazingly potent part of you. Let's begin right now with a simple exercise. Thinking versus observing. Close your eyes for 1 minute and simply notice what your mind does. Stay on the lookout for any thoughts or images, as if you were a wildlife photographer waiting for an exotic animal to emerge from the undergrowth. If no thoughts or images appear, keep watching. Sooner or later they will show themselves. I guarantee it. Notice where those thoughts or images seem to be located. In front of you, above you, behind you, to one side of you, or within you. Once you've done this for a minute, open your eyes again. That's all there is to it. So read through these instructions once again, then put down the book and give it a go. What you experienced were two distinct processes going on. First, there was the process of thinking. In other words, some thoughts or images appeared. Then there was the process of observing. That is, you were able to notice or observe those thoughts and images. It's important to experience the distinction between thinking and observing, because as the book goes on, we'll be using each process in different ways. So just try the above exercise once more. Close your eyes for about a minute, notice what thoughts or images appear, and notice where they seem to be located. Hopefully, this little exercise gave you a sense of distance between you and your thoughts. Thoughts and images appeared, then disappeared again, and you were able to notice them come and go. Another way of putting this is that your thinking self produced some thoughts, and your observing self observed them. Our thinking self is a bit like a radio, constantly playing in the background. Most of the time it's the radio doom and gloom show, broadcasting negative stories 24 hours a day. It reminds us of bad things from the past. It warns us of bad things to come in the future, and it gives us regular updates on everything that's wrong with us. Once in a while it broadcasts something useful or cheerful, but not too often. So if we're constantly tuned into this radio, listening to it intently, and worse, believing everything we hear, then we have a surefire recipe for stress and misery. Unfortunately, there's no way to switch off this radio. Even Zen masters are unable to achieve such a feat. Sometimes the radio will stop of its own accord for a few seconds, or even, very rarely, for a few minutes. But we just don't have the power to make it stop, unless we short-circuit it with drugs, alcohol, or brain surgery. In fact, generally speaking, the more we try to make this radio stop, the louder it plays. But there is an alternative approach. Have you ever had a radio playing in the background, but you were so intent on what you were doing that you didn't really listen to it? You could hear the radio playing, but you weren't paying attention to it. In practicing diffusion skills, we are ultimately aiming to do precisely that with our thoughts. Once we know that thoughts are just bits of language, we can treat them like background noise. We can let them come and go without focusing on them and without being bothered by them. This is best exemplified by the thanking your mind technique. See Chapter 5. An unpleasant thought appears, but instead of focusing on it, you simply acknowledge its presence. Thank your mind, and return your attention to what you're doing. So here's what we're aiming for with all these diffusion skills. If the thinking self is broadcasting something unhelpful, the observing self need not pay attention. The observing self can instead focus its attention on what you are doing here and now. If the thinking self is broadcasting something useful or helpful, then the observing self can tune in and pay attention. This is very different from approaches such as positive thinking, which are like airing a second radio show, Radio Happy and Cheerful, alongside Radio Doom and Gloom, in the hope of drowning it out. It's pretty hard to stay focused on what you're doing when you have two radios playing different tunes in the background. Notice, too, that letting the radio play on without giving it much attention is very different from actively trying to ignore it. Have you ever heard a radio playing and tried not to listen to it? What happened? The more you tried not to hear it, the more it bothered you, right? The ability to let thoughts come and go in the background while you keep your attention on what you are doing is very useful. Suppose you're in a social situation and your mind is saying, "I'm so boring, I have nothing to say. I wish I could go home." It's hard to have a good conversation if you're giving all your attention to those thoughts. Similarly, suppose you're learning to drive and your thinking self is saying, "I can't do it. It's too hard. I'm going to crash." It's hard to drive well if your observing self is focused on those thoughts, rather than on the road. The following technique will teach you how to let your thoughts pass on by, while you keep your attention on what you're doing. 10 deep breaths. Take 10 deep breaths, as slowly as possible. You may prefer to do this with your eyes closed. Now focus on the rise and fall of your rib cage, and the air moving in and out of your lungs. Notice the sensations as the air flows in. Your chest rising, your shoulders lifting, your lungs expanding. Notice what you feel as the air flows out. Your chest falling, your shoulders dropping, the breath leaving your nostrils. Focus on completely emptying your lungs. Push out every last bit of air, feeling your lungs deflate, and pause for a moment before breathing in again. As you breathe in, notice how your tummy gently pushes outward. Now let any thoughts and images come and go in the background, as if they were cars passing by outside your house. When a new thought or image appears, briefly acknowledge its presence, as if you were nodding at a passing motorist. As you do this, keep your attention on the breath, following the air as it flows in and out of your lungs. You may find it helpful to silently say to yourself, "thinking," whenever a thought or image appears. Many people find this helps them to acknowledge and let go of the thought. Give it a go, and if it's helpful, keep doing it. From time to time, a thought will capture your attention. It will hook you and carry you away, so that you lose track of the exercise. The moment you realize you've been hooked, take a second to notice what distracted you. Then gently unhook yourself and refocus on your breathing. Now read through the instructions once more, then put the book down and give this a go. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. How did you go? Most people get hooked up and carried away by their thoughts several times during that exercise. This is how thoughts typically affect us. They reel us in, pulling our attention away from what we're doing. So, although we may say that our mind wanders, this is not accurate. In reality, it's our attention that wanders. By regularly practicing this technique, you will learn 3 important skills. 1. How to let thoughts come and go without focusing on them. 2. How to recognize when you've been hooked by your thoughts. 3. How to gently unhook yourself from thoughts and refocus your attention. When practicing this technique, notice the distinction between your thinking self and your observing self. The observing self focuses on the breath, while the thinking self chatters away in the background. Notice also that this is an acceptance strategy, not a control strategy. We aren't trying to change, avoid, or get rid of unwanted thoughts. We're simply allowing them to be there, to come and go as they please. Fortunately, this is an easy technique to practice, because you can do it anytime, anywhere. Therefore, aim to practice this exercise throughout the day, while you're stuck at traffic lights, waiting in line at a store, while you're on hold on the telephone, waiting for someone to get ready, during television commercial breaks, when you're having your morning tea or coffee, and in bed last thing at night, or before you get up. Basically, try it anytime you have a moment to spare. If you don't have time for the full 10 breaths, even 3 or 4 can be useful. In particular, try it anytime you realize that you're all caught up in your thoughts. Remember, when you're doing this technique, it doesn't matter how many times you get hooked. Each time you notice it and unhook yourself, you're getting more proficient at a valuable skill. When doing this technique, let go of any expectations. Simply notice what effect it has when you do it. Many people find it quite relaxing, but please don't regard it as a relaxation technique. When relaxation occurs, remember, it's merely a beneficial byproduct, not the main aim. Obviously enjoy it when it does occur, but don't come to expect it, or sooner or later you're bound to be disappointed. I've designed the above brief exercises for busy people who say they don't have enough time in the day to do formal diffusion practice. However, not enough time is just another story. So here's a challenge for you. If you really want to get good at this, then as well as doing all those brief exercises, put aside 5 minutes twice a day to practice focusing on your breath. For example, you may do 5 minutes first thing in the morning, and 5 minutes during your lunch break. During these times, keep your attention totally on your breath, while letting your thoughts come and go in the background, and each time you notice your attention has wandered, gently bring it back. Also, if you haven't already tried it, then try silently saying to yourself, "thinking," whenever a thought or image appears. Some people find this very helpful as a way of acknowledging the thinking process without getting caught up in it. However, if you don't find it helpful, then don't bother with it. Realistic expectations. Diffusion skills are essential for escaping the happiness trap. If you can see your thoughts for what they are, just words, and let them come and go without focusing on them, then you can put your time and energy into more important things, such as taking action to create the life you want. Your mind will never stop telling you unpleasant stories, at least not for long. That's just what minds do. So let's be realistic. The fact is, you will get hooked up and reeled in by these stories again and again. That's the bad news. The good news is, you can make dramatic improvements. You can learn to get hooked much less often. You can learn to recognize much faster when you have been hooked, and you can learn to get much better at unhooking yourself. All these abilities will help to keep you out of the happiness trap. As for the observing self, we've only just begun to scratch the surface. The observing self is a very powerful ally in transforming your life, and we'll return to it many times in later chapters. Meanwhile, We now come to the final chapter on diffusion, in which we learn how to deal with scary pictures. Chapter 8. Scary Pictures. Roxy trembled. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes teary. "What's the diagnosis?" I asked her. "Multiple sclerosis," she whispered. Roxy was a 32-year-old lawyer, dedicated to her profession. One day at work, she noticed a weakness and numbness in her left leg, and within a few days, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, or MS. MS is a disease in which the nerves in the body degenerate, creating all sorts of physical problems. In the best-case scenario, you may have one fleeting episode of neurological disturbance from which you fully recover, never to be bothered again. In the worst case, the MS steadily worsens, and your nervous system progressively deteriorates until you are severely physically disabled. Doctors have no way of predicting how it will affect a patient. Not surprisingly, this was extremely distressing news for Roxy. A frightening diagnosis, with no way of predicting the outcome. Roxy's mind had always had a tendency to imagine the worst. This is a useful trait for lawyers, because it allows them to anticipate every possible problem in a criminal or civil case. But now, this trait became a hindrance, as Roxy kept imagining herself in a wheelchair, her body horribly deformed, her mouth twisted and drooling. Every time this image popped into her head, it terrified her. She tried telling herself all the usual common-sense things. "Don't worry, it will probably never happen to you. Your chances are excellent. Cross that bridge if and when you come to it. What's the point of worrying about something that may never happen?" Friends, family, and doctors also tried to reassure her with similar advice. But did that get rid of this scary image? Not in the least. Roxy found she could sometimes push the image out of her head, but it wouldn't stay away for long, and when it returned, it seemed to bother her even more than before. This commonly used, but ineffective control strategy is known as thought suppression. Thought suppression means actively pushing distressing thoughts or images out of your head. For example, each time an unwanted thought or image appears, you might say to yourself, "No, don't think about it," or "Stop it," or you might just mentally shove it away. Research shows that although this method often gets rid of distressing thoughts or images in the short term, after a while, there is a rebound effect. The negative thoughts return in greater numbers and intensity than before. Most of us have a tendency to conjure up frightening images of the future. How often have you seen yourself failing, being rejected, making a fool of yourself, losing your job, getting sick, growing old and weak, or getting into trouble of some kind? In a state of cognitive fusion, these mental pictures seem incredibly real, as if what we're imagining were actually taking place, here and now. Naturally, this can create a lot of fear. To paraphrase Mark Twain, we live through many frightening experiences in our lifetime, and most of them never happen. Unpleasant or unnerving images will pop up again and again whenever we are faced with challenges in life, and we can waste a lot of precious time dwelling on them or trying to get rid of them. Moreover, if we completely fuse with these images, they may seem so frightening that they scare us away from doing the things we value. For example, many people avoid air travel because their minds conjure up images of the plane crashing. In cognitive fusion, we take these images seriously, give them all our attention, react to them as if they are actually happening, treat them as if they are an accurate prediction of the future. In cognitive diffusion, we recognize that images are nothing more than pictures. Pay attention to them only if they are helpful. The diffusion techniques we use with images are very similar to the ones we use with thoughts. Initially, we need to focus on these images in order to practice diffusing them. But the ultimate aim is to be able to let these images come and go without giving them much attention at all. It's like having the television on in the background, without really watching it. Diffusion techniques help us to see these images for what they are, nothing more than colorful pictures. Once we recognize this, we can let them be there without fighting them, without judging them, and without trying to avoid them. In other words, we can accept them. Acceptance means we no longer have to fear them. Acceptance means we no longer waste our precious energy on struggling with them. And ultimately, acceptance means we can focus on something more constructive. Before trying out the following techniques, it's important to say a few words about painful memories. We store memories with all 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. The techniques that follow are often helpful with visual memories, that is, memories which have been stored primarily as images. In cognitive fusion, we give these memories all our attention. React to them as if they are happening here and now. React to them as if they are dangerous or harmful. In cognitive diffusion, we recognize these memories are nothing more than pictures. Know that they happened in the past and can no longer hurt us. Pay attention to them only if they are helpful. However, when working with memories, you need to be careful. While the techniques in this chapter are helpful for coming to terms with many unpleasant memories, such as times you have failed, screwed up, been rejected, humiliated, or embarrassed, they may not be appropriate for more traumatic memories. If you are deeply distressed by traumatic memories of rape, torture, child abuse, domestic violence, or other serious incidents, I don't recommend you use these methods by yourself. Instead, you should learn how to diffuse such memories with an appropriately trained therapist. Diffusing unpleasant images. No technique known to humanity is 100% reliable, and diffusion techniques are no exception. If you find that a particular technique doesn't work, just notice what it's like to be fused and move on to a different one. For each technique, first read through the instructions, then bring to mind a troublesome image that tends to recur. If it's a moving image, condense it into a 10-second video clip. Next, put the book down and try the technique. If any technique seems inappropriate, don't do it. Television screen. Bring an unpleasant image to mind and notice how it's affecting you. Now imagine there's a small television screen across the room from you. Place your image on the television screen. Play around with the image. Flip it upside down, turn it on its side, spin it around and around, stretch it sideways. If it's a moving video clip, play it in slow motion, then play it backwards in slow motion, then play it forwards at double speed, then reverse it at double speed. Turn the color down so it's all in black and white. Turn the color and brightness up until it's ridiculously lurid, so the people have bright orange skin and the clouds are hot pink. The idea is not to get rid of this image, but to see it for what it is, a harmless picture. You may need to do this for anything from 10 seconds to 2 minutes until you really diffuse it. If at the end of 2 minutes it's still bothering you, then try the next technique. Silly subtitles or voiceovers. Keeping that image on the television screen, add a humorous subtitle or voiceover to it, such as The Ultimate Disaster. Premieres on Channel 4 Friday, 7:30 p.m., or now showing at a movie theater near you, I got rejected by my lover. If this image is linked to a story that you've already named, then use that name on the subtitle or voiceover. For example, an image of you failing might be subtitled, The Failure Story. If it's still bothering you at the end of another 30 seconds, try the next technique. Musical soundtrack. Keeping that image on the television screen, add a musical soundtrack of your choice. Experiment with a few different soundtracks: jazz, hip-hop, classical, rock, or your favorite movie themes. If the image is still bothering you, try the next technique. Shifting locations. Visualize this image in a variety of different locations. Stay with each scenario for 20 seconds before shifting to a new one. Visualize your image on the t-shirt of a jogger or a rock star. Visualize it painted on a canvas or on a banner, flying behind an airplane. Visualize it as a bumper sticker, as a magazine photo, or as a tattoo on someone's back. Visualize it as a pop-up on a computer screen, or as a poster in a teenager's bedroom. Visualize it as the image on a postage stamp, or as a drawing in a comic book. Use your imagination with this. The sky's the limit. If you're still fused with the image after all this, that is, if it's still upsetting you, frightening you, or taking up all your attention whenever it appears, then I would suggest you practice running through some or all of the above exercises every single day for at least 5 minutes. This is what I asked Roxy to do, and within a week that image of herself in a wheelchair was no longer bothering her. It still appeared from time to time, but it no longer frightened her, and she was able to let it come and go while she stayed focused on more important things. Paradoxically, the less she tried to push this image away, the less often it appeared. This was not the intention, but it's something that often happens as a positive side effect. It makes sense when you think about the rebound effect, which so often occurs when you try to push thoughts and images away. For less troublesome images, you can easily adapt other diffusion techniques. Instead of "I'm having the thought that," you can acknowledge, "I'm having the image of," for example, "I'm having the image of screwing up the interview." If the image is a memory, you could try, I'm having the memory of. You could even think, my mind's showing me a picture of. Instead of naming the story, you can name the picture. For example, aha, the lonely and miserable picture. You can even name the memory, aha, the nasty rejection memory. And you can always say, thanks, mind, for whatever picture it sends you. Changing genres. This is most useful with moving images. First, convert the image into a short video clip, then visualize it on a television screen. Now try playing that clip in different film genres. For example, imagine it as a gangster movie, a western, a trashy soap opera, a sci-fi thriller, a Disney cartoon, or a musical. Each time you switch genres, change the clothes, sets, and acting styles. But don't try to alter what actually happens. Keep the basic story exactly the same. Play it over and over in different genres until you can truly see that this is just a moving picture and nothing more. Remember, diffusion is all about acceptance. The idea is not to get rid of these images, but to let go of struggling with them. Why should you accept them? Because the reality is, for the rest of your life, in one form or another, scary pictures will appear. Remember, your mind evolved from a don't get killed device. It saved your ancestors' hides by sending them warnings, an image of a bear sleeping in the back of that cave, or of a hungry saber-toothed tiger crouched on that rock. So after 100,000 years of evolution, your mind is not suddenly going to say, oh, hang on a minute, all the wolves and bears have disappeared now. I don't need to keep sending out these warnings anymore. Sorry, but minds don't work like that. Again, don't believe this just because I say so. Check your own experience. Despite everything you've tried over the years, isn't it a fact that your mind still produces unpleasant pictures? So we need to learn how to live with these things, to pay them attention if they're helpful, or let them come and go if they're not. And once again, I have to prepare you. When you practice these techniques, your unpleasant images will often disappear, or at least reduce in frequency, and you will often feel much better. But remember, these outcomes are merely beneficial byproducts, not the main aim. If you start diffusing thoughts or images with the aim of getting rid of them, then you're not truly accepting them. Rather, you're trying to use an acceptance strategy as a control strategy, and ultimately, that will backfire. So use the techniques in the way they were intended, and for the right reasons, and they'll help keep you free of the happiness trap.